So I've been discussing the relation between Foucault and the analysis of fifth columnary, which is generally a covert operation, but it has overt aspects to it in the same way that frauds have their underlying mechanism, but have a superficial front of legitimacy. And the underlying mechanism is actually a criminal act that the front disguises as not being a criminal act. And when it's in the form of a racket or a large-scale organized form of fraud, then the repercussions are even more serious because it's more systematic. It lends itself to a more possibly selectively successful and damaging consequence that may be harder and harder to prosecute as a crime. And so it's taken more seriously as a crime. Now, as I've said about Foucault, he has a relevance. I mean, if you read the notes in the first video in this series, his relevance to this discussion is precisely in that he uncovers empirical evidence that can be construed in controversial ways. In fact, some of the foci of his approach must be construed in controversial ways, including just his methodology of addressing history itself, and then in the constructions that he chooses to take in terms of some of its phenomena, such as the way that certain classes of people are dealt with by prevailing authorities in their time, ranging, just for the sake of this discussion, since the 1600s until now. And then looking at some of these and how they took unusual paths as far as would be considered likely the case given their current narrative. The current narrative of how the matter treated is quite different than how they were treated in the 1400s as compared with the 1600s, as compared with the 1800s, as compared with now. So those differences have to be understood as non-trivial instances of how certain aspects of the controversy in question, say the authority to hold jurisdiction over the Habitat General, for example, that has to be understood as being an expression of authority in general as well, and therefore the empirical study of how that authority existed, which was a quasi-authority between the police and the justice system, the courts, and the king, and how that was placed in its position in the bureaucracy by the king, and then what its jurisdiction was and what was available to it, are all relevant to the discussion of how the same type of category of people, or the same label used to describe a category of people, may have been changed significantly over those periods of time, at least since the 1600s. So it's a very empirical route to reaching some understanding of just those subjects in general: authority, certain categories of mentality, certain aspects of human socio-biological expression like customs, traditions, rituals, stories told, dialectics. But in order to understand those in a context that helps us understand some rather difficult issues that are perennial in philosophy, such as how authority manifests, what are the ideals of justice, what do they mean, what is the nature of the absolute versus the relative in any of these contexts, including for virtue, the development of the status quo in the mass mind versus the question of how history is interpreted, whether as a collection of somewhat relatively independent events, or is there an ecology going on, and is that ecology directed by any sort of entity that transcends the typical approaches we find in history by the conventional academician who wishes to perhaps assiduously avoid those topics for fear of seeming, as the CIA would have dubbed him, a conspiracy theorist. So those become interesting and quite essential tangents to his approach, from the point of view of trying to bridge it methodologically to the discussion of fifth columnary, because he is all but discussing it in several directions, along several vectors: authority as such, and discipline and punish, culture and one of its most biological root aspects, so the history of sexuality, the history of madness in terms of the question of who has credibility in a cognitive or evaluative or ethical or moral or political form, and who doesn't, and how the economics of that power distribution are manifested and parlayed through what channels and over what historical epochs, and why those changes matter and what they mean about how we construe them now. those entities, and also the question of the narrative, how they changed. People, for example, will mythologize in the gaps of history about which they know nothing as a sort of a figment of what they think the status quo is currently, especially if they're not going to be at all versed in the historical fact or dig further into the current narrative than is fed them by certain outlets of propaganda. And the discussion of that matter can also itself be fed in, although I'm not familiar with his work in propaganda per se, or semiotics as such, but perhaps in the order of things he is beginning to approach that direction, because it was the more methodological of his seminal works. He also did address the issue of the authority of medicine and how it's been handled in different ways in different epochs in the birth of the clinic. But all these are sort of tertiary compared with the fundamental issue of propaganda in his work, only because he actually includes all of these apparatuses for the way that society handles these domains of its action as being tantamount to extensions or propagations of an intent of some sort. But he doesn't really hone in on what that is. He sort of leaves it in the general abstract, because that's what an academician in his position would have to do. But in fact, all those vectors that he does handle through his method, through his heuristic of an archaeology of thought or an archaeology of culture, etc., an archaeological approach to history, you might even say, in his method of looking at sources, all these point toward a causally discernible matrix of likely agencies involved in each case. One can investigate his data and data as such, as he did, original sources or through those who have done an investigation, and find all the elements of a sort of covert activity in place. Covert in that it has its own privileged domain for which the associated domains of human action do not have access. But not in the normal sense of privacy or the privilege of the individual to withhold from others what is his own, which is a fundamental feature of justice. But rather in the sense that it operates as the most exempted from responsibility of all that domain, and operate in tandem with one another in order to achieve certain results, into the consideration of which the rest of society's knowledge and permission is not factored except as a possible threat. Therefore, these are the sine qua non of a racket. And then demonstrating the racket just comes down to cases. It just comes down to what the domain of action is, what the goods are, what the services are, what's being extorted, and so on. But having started with a metabiological analogous analog to the discussion, really, because if you look at the details that I've given from my layman's position, understanding and perspective on the matter, it just turns out that basically fifth columnary is an expression of parasitism and also of predation. So with that in place, one could basically look at it in various other ways, but one has to first take the extension of that analogy to the human semiotic level, and then one can discuss both simultaneously, because the human semiotic, the cultural behavior of the human being and his role-playing activities as individuals, as society in the first case, are tantamount to a discussion of biological activity in this context. And then at the same time, as extended into an analysis of the crime itself and its moral import, the semiology can have an extended discussion through the empirical details of various controversial topics such as authority, sanity, what is virtue, what are the proper bounds of desire, and what form should public domains take with respect to enforcing codes, if any, and what should they be, and so on. So this ongoing discourse is mapped out in a biological analogy, but we find also relevance to many forms of controversial topic, which can all have either a form which is corrupted or a form which is supposedly proper. And then there's a discussion of what is the standard of propriety in that regard, and all that comes back to an analysis of what the fifth column is in its very essence, which is an extortion racket. And so if someone wants to be involved in an extortion racket, they're supposed to go to federal prison, is what I'm saying. Which, now, if they don't go to federal prison for an extortion racket, they should at least go to state prison or something to that effect. Or I say they should be sterilized and exiled onto an island somewhere. But hey, first of all, the understanding of the crime is required. But in order to understand the crime, one must have multiple approaches to understanding how that crime exists, because it's made up of elements which are, as it were, composed into it, like bricks are composed into another structure, which they'll serve in one way or another according to the way that structure is intended to be built. And this, of course, adds up to what are the facilities, and how are these things built to become that facility. In other words, how is their arrangement facilitated, and what's the purpose of it? And so all that comes into the analysis, and then we can understand why that punishment would fit that crime. And that's going light, because technically it's treason and is punishable as an offense of the same sort. But more into that discussion in the end, and then a discussion of how that will either manifest or not manifest, and in what shades of possibility between them. And then that leads directly into the eschatology, because certain things are going to be inevitable and happen to be imminent regardless of how people choose to participate in their unfolding. And that's the eschatology. And current events can spell out where that's going, which I also address. Now, while they do control the internet topologies up to a point, supposedly, where some doofus sitting nearby might be my only actual audience, and this could be constantly rolled over into different places, wherever there's instant communication, wherever there are dupes who are willing to participate in it, wherever, which is just about everybody thinks the internet's open when it's not. It's a closed topological system controlled on a grid that's military, controlled by the military and by intelligence agencies. It's not a public domain. The fact that that is the case lays the groundwork for understanding something as peculiar as why one doofus sitting nearby keeps staring at me while I'm making a video on YouTube, and taking some weird, like the behavior correlates too tightly with a direct audience than I would expect in cases, say, 20 years ago, if I were shooting something and there were no internet as we know it. But that doesn't mean there wasn't an internet as we don't know it 20 years ago, because in fact there was. It's called the SIPRnet, which is a piece of military hardware for their use. But that's extended over a large area. It's a communications network. And naturally has all the protocols in it to protect it from enemy invasion and inspection of its contents. Well, the public could be treated as that by the same system, but it could be rolled out to them as if that didn't exist. And they could just imagine whatever they want to be the case. In other words, they're perfect dupes for this propaganda surveillance system to be rolled out right into their bedrooms. And on top of that, they allow the Internet of Things to encroach on their privacy everywhere else they have an electronic device. So, I mean, the empirical grounds for it is the important thing. It's not about how outlandish or strange seeming the theory is. It's, is there evidence and good reason to believe in it, compared with status quo? That's the heuristic for belief that should be involved, not how strange does it seem to me. It's irrelevant. If you just got brainwashed in a cult, everything's going to seem strange to you. If you grew up in it and never saw the light of day outside the compound, you leave the compound, everything's strange to you. So that's an irrelevant factor almost. It depends on whether or not there is a type of structural brainwashing in place or not, and I have empirical evidence to show that there definitely is, and that the status quo grew as it were in a petri dish of that racket, so that the culture is a sort of catering to it, like a window dressing. And this explains a lot of the vicissitudes of its controversial changes that Foucault addresses. So the empirical tie-ins with mainstream academia, or he's now considered to be quite mainstream as a source for analyzing history and some of its controversial aspects that are relevant to modern day socio-political instabilities and varieties of expression and so on. So he's relevant to anthropology, modern anthropology, really. And he did basically work in an anthropological aspect in his philosophy. And so all that ties into the rackets, all the way from a particular, low level, low rent, commonplace, fifth column, operative, just looking at an app on a cell phone and doing what it tells it to do, all the way to, say, a Rothschild banking scheme that's been going on for over what it looks like to be about 350 years now, and then taking the forms of certain fractional reserve banking rackets. I mean, these all tie in together through a scheme that reflects the essence of each part in the whole. And that can't be an accident. And at the same time, all the empirical facts that can be mapped over it would cause a quantitative analysis to merge with this qualitative analysis. That itself is epic proof of the conditions of which I speak, and all the mechanisms that vie to obstruct the discovery of this to any individual, let alone to every individual, are also included in its analysis and verifiable directly. The dirt boxes exist. All I need is access to the dirt boxes to be provided to me, and I could demonstrate the existence of these rackets empirically, immediately. So it'll go on into the eschatology, though, because there will be no adequate response to this phenomenon inside the world, because it's too thoroughly gutted and corrupted. It's like a lichen growing on a dead tree at this point. It's already fallen over, or may as well have. It doesn't even know it's dead, and now there's lichen growing in it, and the lichen are all happy and acting like, yeah, this is how the universe is. It's centered around them, and they're going to go on the inertia appropriate to that life form, while the rotting corpse of the tree upon which they depend is misrepresented as their essence and still living, and themselves as expositors of that essence. But you have to develop a negative mental space in order to mistake the mere superficial extensions of the tree shape to be your own, as the lichen growing on it in some way does. But the lichen's living processes depend on the death and decomposition of that tree. It's already verified. So the way corruption operates is contrary to its propaganda. But to look into the issue of propaganda, I'm not sure if Foucault has any direct responses to that phenomenon, but he seems to address it in a distributed way over all his discourses. So it works out structurally that they are articulations of basically what propaganda seeks to do, which is extend the will of the person producing the propaganda to become manifest in the public sphere of human action in some way. And that can be done without words, though words may be involved. That can be done without images, though images may be involved. And they will be involved. But how that is structured institutionally is more his approach, rather than as this particular form, media as such. And I'll have to find out who makes a good resource in terms of examining empirical data about that, although there is plenty of work being done on it that's ready to hand, in terms of, just say, the study of some of the work done by Edward Bernays to enhance the control grid through the content and form of propaganda distribution. But we also have the issue of how the covertly controlled internet topologies, which can strangle or inflate any information in that schema and restructure it as it sees fit, also play a role in how that works in terms of, say, an examination of the companies that are nominally involved in most of the internet traffic, such as Google and anything influenced by these cutout billionaires and multi-billionaires. So those would be the directions to look for that empirical data in the modern day, and how you can go back to Hearst when it comes to newspapers, and you can go back all the way to the Gutenberg press, one supposes, and then see how that was involved. The burning of the Library of Alexandria. You could go back quite far in trying to discern how propaganda involving language as a media was either in a positive or negative form expressed. But all those can be seen in tandem, though, with the particular researches in Foucault that I'm including in this analysis of fifth column. And so those I'm looking forward to continuing to study and promulgate as well. in the upcoming videos and articles on my blog and on my channel, The Gnostic Truth. Of course, I have to say, just in case the covert internet topology is so tightly looped that there's just like one fifth column dretch on the other end of it, rubbing its scabby belly. Hell awaits. Just know that. Hell waits. Actually, it waits very actively. It's seeping into the world on a daily basis. Your evasion of it is absolutely going to fail. It's inevitable that it will reach you. And when it does, it will reach you with a hunger proportionate to the delay